Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our podcast. My name is David Chao, and I direct the Center for Asian American Christianity. It's my pleasure to introduce and welcome back to our podcast, Sangeetha Thomas.
Hi, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me back.
Absolutely. Sangeetha is a psychotherapist and the owner of Nepsis Counseling in Dallas, Texas. From what I recall in our first podcast on mental health and Asian American Christians more broadly, we spoke about a difficult topic, the topic of death and the role of spiritual and mental health. And I recall from that first podcast conversation how you mentioned grief, the grieving process surrounding the death of loved ones and those in our community is not a linear
Mhm.
process, it's a recursive process. You and I have spoken a lot about the role of Christian community, especially the church, um, as a as a resource regarding things like grief surrounding death. And I want to pick up some of those threads of our conversation from before. And I thought we could begin today's conversation just by talking about some of the stigma you have perceived from your clinical experience surrounding mental health issues, especially within Asian American communities and Asian American Christian communities. So I'd love to just talk about some of the forms that stigma takes, perhaps in cultural shame, and how that affects your practice as a
Yeah.
psychotherapist.
So I think this is something that has been researched for a long time and is probably not new information because as soon as we say shame about mental health or shame around expressing emotions, I'm pretty sure every Asian American listening is like, well, yeah, that's how I grew up. And so it's not exactly groundbreaking research, but it is valuable to recognize that the research does support it so that when we do try to make generalizations or try to direct ministry in a way that is research based, we have something to stand on and say, okay, this is not just one person's experience, but actually, this is the collective experience of Asian American communities and Eastern Asian cultures. That there is this cultural understanding that we should not share our emotions. We should not share difficult emotions. We should maintain face and we should be put together and we should maintain this impression of being okay and getting along with everyone and being peaceable and being calm. And so that, in some degree, can be good of being emotionally regulated and not completely unhinged all the time. But then there's also this other extreme of it can become very rigid that we can't express emotions. There is no space for emotion, there's no tolerance for emotion. And even that emotional expression could be punished or seen as weakness. And if that exists for emotions, then it's only magnified when it comes to an actual mental health concern or illness or disorder. So if there's no space for I feel sad, then is there any space for I feel depressed? Or is there any space for my grief is not alleviating, right? And this becoming this recursive, persistent thing that I'm not over it yet and I still feel sad about it. So that stigma around mental health and that shame around emotional expression or the masking of emotions is something that exists across all ethnic subgroups of Asian communities. And we have immigrated with that mask. And what the research shows us is that Asian Americans who are born in the States, who are immersed in American culture, they have less stigma than their parents. But then you have this family dynamic where there's stigma in one generation and a little bit less in the next generation, but it's not completely gone away. And so there is a little bit of like this cultural divide that happens in multicultural identity and work and in every generation of now immigrant communities who have a history of cultural masking of emotion, but then are also being raised in American culture where Simone Biles, Michael Phelps, people are out there talking about mental health out in the open, and their friends at school are talking about it out in the open. So there is definitely a dichotomy and a little bit of a conflict that occurs in Asian American culture, and it can it can impact the family dynamic as a whole, which only becomes magnified when we look at a parish community where there's multiple generations in the mix together.
I appreciate your allusion to some of these intergenerational Asian family dynamics where those who have been more assimilated into American culture, the second gen Asian family members, may think that mental health talk is more normal than their parents who were born and were the first to immigrate to the United States or to North America. It reminds me of my recent podcast conversation with Jeff Flew, where we were talking about Gen Z and the language they use and how language is a marker for culture. And when people speak a different kind of coded language, that's a different kind
Mm.
of culture. So we can even think about these different generational layers within the same family structure as different
Mhm.
cultures. And I think that's what you were alluding to. Let me ask you this question about clients that you have, and there may be younger clients, there may be older clients. So you will have experience of different generations of, let's say, Asian Americans, and perhaps some of them are Asian American Christians. What are some patterns that you've noticed that give them permission to come to you for help? So, in other words, were they forced there by someone? Like, right, so it's like, not maybe the adolescent didn't have much choice, or, um, maybe a friend, like, brought them there or, put them on a text thread with you. I'm just wondering, I've heard in certain, like, evangelism classes, someone who doesn't know Jesus needs to hear the gospel 7 times before it becomes plausible for them to, become a
Mm.
Christian. So I'm curious, what are the conditions of possibility or the structures of plausibility for someone who of different generations to actually sit in your office?
Yeah, I wish I had like a magic number of like 7 times, but sometimes there's some days where it honestly feels like 7 times 70, right? Like the scripture says where it's like it takes forever before somebody feels okay, to talk about mental health. But, in terms of patterns that I see with the older immigrant generations or just immigrant generations, let's take age out of the picture. A lot of times what I see is they're open to it when there is a certain degree of desperation and intensity of like, this is an extreme circumstance versus, at least in my practice, there a lot of times I don't necessarily see that with non-Asian clients of mine, that they would wait until the absolute extreme before they seek help. Sometimes with my non-Asian clients, they'll say things like, "Well, I've always known something was a little bit off, or and I finally got the money to make it happen." And so they've been thinking about therapy for a long time. Versus my Asian American clients, often, at least with the especially with the immigrant ones or who have not been living in the States for very long, their motivation to start therapy is something terrible happened and I'm at my breaking point and now I realize I need help. Which I know is might sound like a subtle distinction, but I think there is a distinction between like how bad does it have to be before you ask for help. Now, with the few times I don't work with adolescents, but the few times that I have had parents reaching out for help with their adolescent, again, I see that same pattern of desperation. I don't know what to do with my
Mm,
kid. I don't understand this. This is something I can't fix. I've tried everything. And it's like a last resort type of response to mental health care. Now, with the ones my Asian Americans who have been born or at least majority raised in the States, who identify now more with Western culture in some degree, they're a little bit different. They are able to see the patterns, those intergenerational patterns. They're able to identify my parents, the fact that their parents couldn't talk about these things and that they want to talk about these things. And so they see therapy as, I don't know if you and I have talked about this, but therapy often is reparenting. And so as a therapist, I step in to be the voice of the adult that they always needed and wanted, the parent who has the capacity to hold space for distressing emotions and to have compassion and to have patience in that. And so with my younger American born clients, they see it and they know they need it. And as soon as they have the means to access it, they know somewhere deep down inside that that's what they're looking for. They may not have the words to call it reparenting, but that's the pattern that I see, which is very different from the desperate last resort of the clients who are in a different situation or maybe have recently immigrated.
Reparenting is a powerful way to frame
Mhm.
therapy, especially given the powerful ties of family to form us in good ways and other
Yeah.
ways, right? That's a very dense concept. Wow, I need to think about that, and especially to bring it back to barriers within the Asian American community to seeking mental health. I'm just thinking about church
Mhm.
cultures, both with first gen as well as second gen. And on the one hand, faith in God and worship is a deeply personal thing. And so we have no problems confessing our deepest love for God, worshiping and praising God, even perhaps sharing our spiritual testimonies on occasions as a celebration of our collective and individual faith. Those are deeply, deeply personal things. But then when it comes to we're struggling with depression, potential divorce, or abuse in the family, you know, we have a reticence. I think it's natural, and perhaps the word for it is shame to kind of talk about that or to air our dirty laundry, right? So I was wondering if you had additional observations on certain cultural dynamics within Asian
Mm.
communities that make it hard to create mentally healthy communities and
Mm.
cultures. And just, I think at the end of the podcast, I want to talk more prospectively and perhaps even what are some strategies you might have, but for faith leaders and pastors. But at this point in the conversation, I just want to hear more of your observations about potential cultural
Sure.
barriers to access health.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, our collectivistic culture versus individualistic culture that exists in the East is a huge strength in a lot of ways and can also be a barrier to that. That like our tendency to understand ourselves as part of the collective. That's great. But then when you take that to an extreme, it turns into this idea of having honor for the family, right? Like I think every Asian American has quoted Mulan at one point where it's like there's dishonor and honor. And like that idea that if I have a weakness, if I have an illness, if I have a mental health condition, if I'm struggling, if I have thoughts of suicide, if I mention those things, that it's dishonor on my family, that my entire family is associated with me and my mental health condition and my ancestors and their ancestors before them and the family name, like there's so much pressure that's created around that representation of family and of community. And then, I mean, that you can throw fuel on that fire if you start looking at the whole model minority immigration culture too, that we are supposed to be the ones who have it figured out. We immigrated right, and we're making our American dream happen. So when we start taking things to an extreme of collectivistic identity and honor and making it in America and being able to compete with the white man as an equal, all of those things, we take those to extremes, it can become very rigid and there's no space for less than, there's no space for weakness, there's no space for not having it all together, which is not very human and it's not very Christian because aren't we supposed to be depending on God? Aren't we supposed to be adhering to that verse? When I am weak, then I am strong. I mean, Paul talks about how he takes, I don't think he uses the word pride, but how he essentially celebrates and sees the value in adversity, in going through difficulties, in struggling, and sees how those moments of weakness, whatever they might be, for him, we could even posit that maybe he was haunted by his past of having persecuted Christians and having all of these weaknesses of his own that aren't expanded on in scripture in great detail because it's not his life story. But he talks about having gone through adversity, having gone through persecution, and how he celebrates that as an opportunity for God's grace to act. And instead, what we see in a lot of ways in Asian American culture is like there is such a high standard of excellence and togetherness and honor and all of that, that it almost minimizes and wipes out and doesn't leave any space for God's grace and my weakness, God's grace through my weakness. And so creates this huge conflict, which is, I think, what you're hitting on too, is that as Christians, we should be able to say, look, we should be able to share a faith testimony. And we do. But then where's the testimony that exists in the context with emotions in the picture too? And so it turns into this very like, I don't want to say it's fabricated, but it's almost polished. That testimony of faith doesn't have emotion in it, doesn't have struggle in it, doesn't have pain in it. And that's not how it's meant to be. Like if you read the Psalms, you see the psalmist suffering and struggling and in agony, and you see Christ in agony in the Garden of Gethsemane. But for some reason, when it comes to sharing our own agonies with each other, something about that just does not sit with us, and we don't like showing that.
Wow, Sangeetha, that's really profound. I love the theological reflection on doesn't give us space to do X, doesn't give us space to do
Mm,
Y, and that barrier, that constraint is we can call it culture. I think we need to define culture at
mhm,
some point. What do we mean by culture? What do we even mean by collectivism? But let's just not tackle those thorny thickets for now. But I think you're right that there are social conditions that constrain the theology that we confess in how we practice certain things, like telling our own
mm,
stories during
mm,
testimony time, right? And perhaps just thinking about practices that incorporate insights from mental health as well as the gospel, that modeling perhaps painful narratives in light of God is one way to destigmatize some of these we weebie jeebies that we have about mental health, right? And it says this is how we need to
mm.
redeem social conditions in which we were brought up because they hurt the manifestation of the power of God to transform our lives to be more whole human
Absolutely.
beings.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's where, even when we think we're doing everything right with this testimony of faith, shame can creep in, right? There's always going to be that feeling in the back of your mind that I think was there from Adam and Eve that motivated hiding in the garden, right? Like, even when you want to share everything, there is some little voice in the back of your head that says, we should hide that. We should hide that. We
Mm,
shouldn't share, and they won't
mm.
like that. They won't like us. They will judge us. They will think of us differently. And there's that teeny tiny little voice in the back of your head doubts, that doubts if you really can be seen and tells you it's safer to hide. And that's where, I mean, we can get into all kinds of neuroscience from there about like what the brain is doing in that moment.
Ooh. All right. You put something out there. I want to pick it up, but I also want to mark something like for our Roman Catholic
Mm,
friends out there. There's a sacrament called
mhm,
confession, and confession as a place where we come as we are, as vulnerably as possible, perhaps even with emotionally vulnerable
mm.
language about our pains, our brokenness, our wounds, those negative
Yes.
feelings. And, I wonder how that works in an Asian American church
Mm,
setting, where if people get too vulnerable, people might start cringing in the pews. And what would be some, I don't know, some church practices of not confession in sort of untoward sharing, but, so right there, you can
right.
tell I'm trying to, like, navigate, well,
That's
what is
appropriate.
an appropriate
Yeah.
way? Yeah, yeah, so maybe we can pick that up after the next section
Sure.
here where you mentioned neuroscience. I wanna pick that up, and I wanna tie in more specific negative emotion,
Mm.
grief. And in light of our first podcast on, let's start with death, um, death and dying, the grieving process individually and as a corporate
Mm.
community. And maybe we can begin talking about the grieving process just from neuroscience. And you can fill in, what's going on in the human body and brain in the grieving
Right.
process.
Yes. So grief, I think, is great to put side by side with shame and discomfort and stigma because all of it kind of falls under the category of icky stuff. It falls into the category of discomfort and pain. And that's really just our brains are wired to go towards pleasure and away from pain. And I don't want to overly like minimize the human brain and how God has created us and called us and wired us to be. And also, we have to acknowledge that there is still that almost primitive, animalistic survival drive in all of us that we seek pleasure and we avoid pain. And we learn from pain and then we remember pleasure and we reinforce pathways. And it sounds almost robotic. It almost sounds like a dog at that point. But it's true. It exists in every single one of us. And um, so with grief, last time we met, we talked about how it's recursive. We talked about how painful it is. We talked about, in some ways, that when we come across something that's abstract and not easily understandable, meaning that we have this idea of what death is. We can see somebody die, we can see something die, we can see life passing. But death is not something, I think I said it last time, that you can go to and come back from and talk about your experience. It's not like, oh, I went to Italy and this is what it was like. And now I understand a little bit about what it means to be Italian. Or I can go there and live there for a little bit and I can experience it. And now I have that construct in my head. Um, our minds are meaning making machines is something I always say, and I think most therapists always yammer on about. And so we like to make meaning and understand. And how do you do that with something that you can't go to and come back from? You can't just experience it to understand it. When you experience it, you're dead. Your brain is not working anymore to make that construct. And so, what is unfamiliar is scary. What we can't go to and come back from stays in this really abstract kind of amalgamous type of state. And so, it's harder to make a construct. It's harder to, when I say construct, like we're talking about how the brain makes sense of and builds a narrative around. And with narrative, what we're doing is who am I in relation to this thing? And what does this mean about what the world is and who the people in my life are? From a psychological perspective, that's what we're talking about with constructs. From a theological perspective, sometimes our language fails us and we just land on this phrase, how do I make peace with it? And I think that's what people are talking about when they're talking about making peace with or finding peace in or in, for example, with grief, like you want to get to a point, you wish that for your friends and your family, for yourself, that like after when they experience grief, you want them to reach a state of peace. Um, or resolve or rest or comfort. And so that state where it's not in this active, I can't figure this out, and it's more in this still waters, as the Psalms say, it's in this more calm state of, I've made peace with it. From a therapist perspective, that means, okay, you have integrated this construct into your mind's wiring of who you are, who they are, where they are, what this means in the context of your spirituality and being a child of God. And so that's the whole brain process. But now you add the pain and the discomfort on top of it, and we create this resistance to, I don't want to think about it. I don't want to feel it. I don't want to talk about it. I can't talk about it because it makes other people uncomfortable. And so that internal process of I'm uncomfortable with it becomes magnified when I try to share it with somebody and they're uncomfortable with it. And that becomes further magnified when I try to share it or I want to share it with a community, but I'm afraid of how they might perceive me or judge me or change what they believe about me. And so all of those layers from individual to a one-to-one relationship to a larger community magnifies how much we avoid pain We avoid discomfort. Everything in your mind is telling you, hide, 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 because that's what I need to do to protect myself from the potential of getting hurt by somebody else's judgment. And it's enough to trigger a stress response in anybody. So I'm gonna pause there because I'm seeing your your mind is just like going.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I think, this basic point that humans run from discomfort towards comfort, I'm like, "Oh my gosh," I think that pretty much describes, like, the incentive structure surrounding the decisions I make, right? Is like, I don't even think about making comfort like, yes, I seek comfort, and it takes intent and will and, like, working myself up to, an uncomfortable or kind of confronting the discomfortable things that I know that I
Yes.
need to. And in some of our past conversations, you've mentioned certain complex scenarios like suicide, miscarriage, overdose, community
Mhm.
rejection, talking about the prevalence of loneliness and the difficulty of friendships today, in a culture and society that's very fragmented. Can you run through some of the discomfort of those
Sure. Yeah,
scenarios?
absolutely. And I think this is where the discomfort, it's not, we're not just talking about discomfort here. We are talking about a deep pain that is caused in, I could say deep pain with grief too, depending on how close you are to a person. But most folks that are not in the mental health world have some kind of a deeper, it's not just discomfort, it's almost a fear reaction when you mention suicide or when you mention miscarriage. And it's, you can almost see their most of the time, if you're paying attention, you can see their body language shift, you can see their vocal tones shift, voices get really low and you start whispering, and there's a lot of like hushy hushy around it because it's, you don't understand it, right? Like, how many of us are comfortable talking about suicide? How many of us are comfortable talking about miscarriage in the open? How many of us talk about substance use and overdose and alcoholism? Like, there's definitely mumblings and mutterings behind the back. But how many times do you see people doing that face to face, genuinely being vulnerable and talking about it out in the open? And we don't see it. So, what we don't practice, we don't get stronger at doing. And what we avoid, we just perpetuate that pain, that discomfort, that fear, that stress response that says, avoid this, run from this, end this conversation, wrap it up, tell them to pray about it and walk the other way. And you turn into the other people who were in that Good Samaritan parable, right? You don't turn into the person who approaches a person who's suffering. And instead, you look at them and you're like, whoop, something happened there. And you just walk the other way. That's pain avoidance, and that happens anytime someone is struggling with suicide, thoughts of suicide, let alone has attempted suicide or died by suicide. When someone struggles with miscarriage and child loss, like, I can't tell you how many times, at least in my South Asian, Indian American community, how many times it becomes brushed on, not, I don't hate to say brushed under the rug, but honestly, that's what happens is maybe they mention it, but then we don't bring it up anymore. We don't talk about it. We don't acknowledge that people who have lost a child to miscarriage, they carry that grief intensely every day of their life, moving forward from that. And the rest of us who have not experienced the loss of a child have the privilege of not thinking about that. And so we don't always do a great job of recognizing how persistent and recursive and painful grief can be. And I mean that I mean, we could talk about overdose, we could talk about substance use. I can't tell you how many times I've heard stories of people who died by substance use, and when it came to announcing like a death announcement in the community, they will say something like cardiac arrest, right? Because medically speaking, that's what happened, but it happened because of a drug overdose, happened because of a relapse, it happened because of something else, or kidney failure, right? Like they'll amount it to something medical because it sounds cleaner, and it sounds like we can kind of hide the shame of the fact that I have a family member who struggled with addiction for years and I never shared it with anybody. And we thought they got clean and then they suddenly overdosed and now they're gone. I never talked about it then, and so how can I just drop that bomb now? And so that's where the shame and the pain avoidance definitely comes up. But I also do want to touch on, there are instances when you had mentioned community rejection. We've talked about that previously, that there are instances when there is grief that's not associated with death. It's grief of like more abstract losses, such as, for example, members of the LGBTQ community might be rejected by their community or their parents or more traditional immigrant cultures, and they will experience a loss of community, a loss of closeness, a loss of relationships. That can feel like grief. And so, in some very, very traditional cultures or conservative cultures, whatever word you want to use for that, the way you talk about a person who struggles with alcoholism or drug overdose or has died by suicide is the same way they talk about somebody who's gay. Like, God forbid we say gay, and we whisper it, or divorced, right? And we're married again. And so there's stigma and shame around not just mental health, not just the pain, the recurring pain of grief, but also around just being different, having a different identity than what we imagined. And I mean, sometimes I even see that with members of the community who marry outside of their ethnic group, that they're different. Oh, they married a white person, and like now we don't talk about them anymore. We don't check in on them anymore. And like, oh, they're other. And that can be an intense grief as well. And I think that is just as valid as the grief that we experience when somebody dies.
You're describing the last portion of what you were saying is almost a
Oh,
social
yeah,
death.
absolutely.
You're dead to me if you do X, Y,
Yes.
or Z.
That is rejection.
Yeah, and the feelings associated with that are akin to biological
Yes.
death.
Yes.
It's just as
It
powerful.
is. And, we talk about, I'm sure you've heard the research on how heartbreak as a psychological and emotional experience, it triggers the same neurons that we feel during like physical pain. It feels like physical pain in the brain, emotional pain and physical pain, they're wired the same way. So these intense moments of heartbreaking grief, heartbreaking loss, this gut wrenching, we use words like that, heartbreaking, gut wrenching, is because we have clusters of neurons in the gut, in the heart, in the mind, that are all wired to help us learn from pain. And for survival, that's great. But when it turns into a psychological pain that now feels like as real as a physical pain, that's that's torture. It feels like a death. A breakup can feel like a death. The end of a relationship can feel like a death. The rejection from community based on someone's identity or life circumstance can absolutely feel like I'm dead to them and they died to me, but I'm still alive.
Say more about the consequences, even the cost individually, within the family, within the community for not addressing discomfort, grief
Mm.
appropriately. In other words, if we do not adapt mentally healthy practices such as acceptance, verbalization, destigmatization, like what is the
Right.
cost?
Um, on the one hand, as a therapist, what I see is it wreaks havoc on the body and the mind and the soul too, right? Like, what is it? You and I talked about that when we encounter these really difficult things, our minds end up reevaluating. Who am I? What does this mean about the world? What does this mean about safety? What does this mean about spirituality? Like, for example, when you experience the death to cancer, why would God allow this to happen is usually the question that comes up. And in a number of other circumstances too. And so on the one hand, these intense situations of grief or rejection can wreak havoc, as I say, but essentially they shake us to our core, and they force us to reevaluate who we are, and sometimes that takes a long time. So that's what I see, and the work that's done in therapy. Now, I would also say, like, in the discussion about what grief is and what it means. And like you said, if we don't adopt these practices, what happens? There's a term for this called disenfranchised grief, which is basically we have to understand the definition that grief is the internal process. What is happening in my inner world as I try to assimilate that construct that this person who was here is now no longer here. That's like my brain is trying to take a file out of this person is living in accessible cabinet and put it into the this person is no longer living on earth and is only accessible through intercessory prayers cabinet. And and that is really the internal grief process and all the emotions that come with that and the hard work that comes with that. Grief that is externalized and expressed, talked about, is mourning. That's a more accurate. That external expression is mourning. So what disenfranchised grief is when that internal process cannot be externalized because of stigma, because of shame, because of cutoff and rejection, because of whatever else in the community or in the family system it becomes disenfranchised. That grief that is all this like balled up mess of emotions inside doesn't have a place to go. And so it gets stuck inside and recirculates and it turns into this like toxic level of holding it all in this exhausting process of just sometimes I describe it as like you're burning up from the inside when you hold your emotions inside because emotions at the end of the day are energy, right? They're informative, but they are very intense. And if they don't have a place to go, it just eats you up, burns you up from the inside. And there's all kinds of research about how emotional suppression can lead to immunological disorders, right? Like it can lead to body aches and pains. It can lead to a decreased ability to recover from illness, like your immune system. The part of you that is meant to keep you alive has a difficult time working. I shouldn't say it all goes as far as stops working, but it becomes impaired by emotions that are being suppressed that need to be expressed. And so when we can't express them, it becomes disenfranchised, doesn't have a place to go. It turns into this aching, this longing. And when we have people walking around like that in an entire community, and then they get married, and then they have kids, and then it perpetuates from one generation to the next. And then we also tell them, well, you can bring everything to God, and church is where you feel safe. And it creates this sense of like, I can't share anything, but also I'm supposed to be vulnerable in church. And it creates this weird conflict of I'm going to church saying one thing, but then I go home to a family doing another. And or I stand in the worship service, the liturgy, whatever church you're part of, and we say one thing that, God knows everything and I can be vulnerable with him and da 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 da. And then we get into the coffee hour and we're all filtered and masked up already. And so there's this very weird disconnect, which leads to conflict, either internally or between people of what is my identity? What does it really mean to be a Christian? And are these people just preaching something and not actually doing it? And do I want to be a part of that? And so then we start getting into all kinds of theological, spiritual identity issues from there.
That's a great transition point. I want to think actively now about our audience members who are pastors,
Mhm.
faith leaders. Some of them could be campus staff workers. They are shepherding a flock. They are cultivating a culture for their community. Um, they are mentoring and developing leaders or elders. They're discipling people. How do we create mentally healthy community cultures? That's the
Mm.
big umbrella. And I thought maybe we could begin because your comment about the liturgy, the coffee time where we mask up, where we filter ourselves, those are really apt verbs for perhaps not
Mhm.
healthy cultures. And then I want to play through the permutations here. It's like, well, so a dissenter and objection could be, but church is not a therapy session, right? And my friends are not trained therapists. Some things need to be clinically diagnosed, and perhaps even medicine needs to be
Sure. Yeah.
prescribed. Right? So that's not appropriate for
Mm.
pastors because it requires a referral, right? So help us sort through different scenarios and I would like to hear some perhaps best practices that faith leaders could implement that are resonant with mental health research and
Right.
practice.
Um, and this is great because it gets into the like very clearly defining what it is to be a community, what it is to have a culture at all. And you had mentioned earlier, like, well, we haven't really even defined culture. And here I'm talking about South Asian culture or Asian culture. And I mean, the best place to start is what is the culture of the church? With that, not the capital C church as an institution, but what is the culture of your individual four walls parish? When a stranger walks in, what's the impression that they get about who they can talk to, what they can talk about, what is appropriate? Because, I mean, appropriateness is a cultural construct, it's a social construct.
I like that. Yeah, what's in bounds, what's out of
Yes,
bounds as appro
absolutely, and we
yeah.
are social beings, like, we're wired with the exception of, individuals who are neurodivergent, autistic, who don't have the ability to track those social norms and boundaries. For those who are, in the typical range, that is something that we are wired to do, is to know what's normal, what's not normal, what's accepted, what's not accepted. So this is very much part of our wiring to be able to evaluate and filter and mask and protect and hide and and to be sensitive to shame. So we have to keep tabs on that. If you want your church to be a community in the truest sense, an actual community, not just a country club where we get together and see people who look like us and who are raised like us and immigrated from a place like us. We're looking for a real, genuine, heartfelt, Christ-like, vulnerable, courageous community. You have to be able to measure what are our boundaries? What do we make okay by our actions, by our inactions? What do we communicate to other people, and sometimes when we talk about organizational systems, you have to think about it in a more concrete sense to understand it in the abstract. So like if I had a machine, if I had a phone, if I had a computer, right? Like what you're looking for to see there's diagnostic criteria or car, right? You know what you're looking for to make it in the bounds of it's operating the way that it ought to be operating versus not operating the way that it ought to be operating, right? Like my car will tell me if it needs oil or if it's low on oil or if the engine's running too hot. My phone will tell me if it's running too hot or if something's wrong with the software bugs and issues, right? So do you have those KPIs, those diagnostic metrics for your
What does
like key
KPI stand
performance
for?
indicators? So this is it's borrowing a term from the business world of what are the measurable things that you are looking for, and in terms of performance. So if it was a phone, we want the technology to function. If it's a car, I want to get from point A to point B without it breaking down. If it's a church, what is the performance indicator? What are we measuring here? What does it mean to be a community? What does it mean to exemplify Christ like love that is not hiding behind shame? What are we doing? Where are we at now? And where do we want to be? Like as leaders, we have to zoom out of our church sometimes and be like, hold on, what are we really doing? If a stranger walked in, how would they feel?
Yeah.
And what do I want them to feel instead?
Right. So when a stranger walks in and has been there for
Uh-huh.
6 months, right? So there's surface culture that presents initially, and then there's the deeper culture that is the more
Mm,
operative one. And I just think about the cases you alluded to earlier about someone sitting in liturgy, confessing or praying these prayers of vulnerability, and then feeling so not vulnerable during the coffee fellowship
yes.
time. And that church practice will slap that person in the face enough times where either they have to die to getting slapped in the face or they have to live with integrity and go somewhere else or not go to that space
Right.
anymore. And if I'm a church leader, I don't want that person to leave because we're called to be there for them as a church
Hmm.
family. Right? This is the family analogy again. And so I think I would wanna begin talking with my leadership team and kind of community members, they could be the elders of your church, what have you, about who are those folks potentially on the
Mm.
fringe that we're going to lose if we don't audit our KPIs in the most
Yes.
appropriate way, right? I would begin thinking from those fringe cases to transform the culture of our
Absolutely.
church.
Yeah, and I mean, as a therapist, this is how we set up treatment plans, right? So we take a snapshot. Where am I at now? And then we create a goal. We visualize a goal. Where do I want to be? And then the rest is getting from point A to point B, right? Like that's treatment planning from a therapy perspective. But like you said, if we're going to learn from business culture and we're going to learn from other systems and how they're organized, we have to be able to identify like what are the key performance indicators? How do I know I'm operating the way that I need to be operating? Where are we now? How are we doing at retaining people who walk in off the street? Do they come back a second time? Do they come back for 6 months? Do they come back after a year? Or do they walk in and they're like, whoop, this is not for me. And they walk right back out again, And is that a performance indicator? Is the retention of people who were born into that church, into that parish, is their lifetime retention something that you actually pay attention to? Because there are a lot of immigrant churches where Asian Americans or second generation are born into that church, and the older they get, the more they realize this intergenerational clashing of saying one thing and doing the other, and they end up leaving, and nobody notices that they left, and nobody does anything to bring them back. That's a KPI that's been ignored for years and is I mean, we're losing an entire generation. Some of these immigrant churches are bleeding out, and young people are going elsewhere or not coming to church at all because they realize Christianity is a sham, because that's the Christianity they grew up with.
I'm thinking of all the difficulties around crafting these
Hmm.
KPIs for an intergenerational Asian church that has families. So let me begin to problematize. This is so women are going to have different pressure
Yes.
points than men, given role differentiation. Parents are going to have different pressure
Mm.
points than singles. The aunties and uncles or grandmas and grandpas who are older, they're going to have different pressure points than people in earlier life stages. So if we just use the kind of biological life stage thing, there's Maslow's hierarchy of needs that kind of evolve with evolving life stages, but the evolving life stages also point to different mental health pressure points and
Well,
therefore needs. So it's like the KPIs are not going to be a one size fits all, right? They have to then be differentiated according to life stages and the different circumstances and pressure points. Something that bothered me when I was in my 20s, I don't even think
oh yeah.
about in my 50s. And so therefore my kind of therapeutic needs are going to be vastly different, even though I'm the
Yes.
same person, right? I'm a person with an evolving
Yeah.
history. And I think this then poses a huge demand upon pastors and leaders within faith communities that are committed to a long journey, right? When you're committed to walking with a community for 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years, which is rare, but we should
Hmm.
aspire to that, then you're going to constantly have to kind of retool the pastoral toolkit according to the different
Right.
stages, right?
Absolutely. And I love that you included Maslow because I think that's a great place to start is what are the basic needs we all need? And at the bottom of it all is safety. And so this whole time you and I are talking about shame and stigma and the need that's not being met is emotional safety. And that's a great KPI to start with. Is my church an emotionally safe church?
Ooh, that's
That's a big one,
good.
right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, it's big, but it's also it gives us a place to start, right? There's all the psychological theory and all these different demographics and all their different needs and all their different age, life stages, and that can feel a little bit overwhelming. So let's start with something a little bit tangible: is my church emotionally safe? Survey your people. Put out a survey. Like, what does it mean to be emotionally safe? Do you know what that means? Do you know what you're looking for? What would that mean to you for this church to be more emotionally safe? Ask your people, like, what would you like to see us do differently so you could feel more emotionally safe in your life stage, in your personal mental health history, family history, and struggles that none of us maybe even know about. What would help you, the individual person, feel more emotionally safe? And then take all of that feedback from a survey, put it together, and make a plan, and collect a little bit of demographic data so you can cluster people into different age groups or whatever. And you can take that type of data and have data driven ministry that is actually a legitimate response to real needs. And so I don't want anyone to hear this as a faith leader and be like, "Oh my gosh, this is now I have to like mentally evaluate every single parishioner and all of this." But let's just start with emotional safety. From there, you can look at things like, yes, Maslow has a hierarchy of needs, and also, the most basic life stage development model that's very widely used and has been used for a long time and is the least amount controversial as psychological theories go is Erickson's stages. So if any leader who's listening wants to look up Erickson's life stages, there's about 8 of them. And so you can look at any given life stage, what is a person looking for? So in later life, we're dealing with the idea of generativity, and in young adulthood, we're looking at the idea of identity formation, right? And so when I talk about younger generations who've been raised in the church who are leaving, their main motivation and task of life is identity. They are evaluating, do I want to be a Christian if this is what Christianity is? And older people are looking at, how do I still stay generative or relevant to my community when I have aged beyond that productivity stage? When I'm in my older life stages, do people still need me? Right. And if you have grandparents in your own life or aging parents in your own life, they're struggling with that too. They still want to be needed. Right. That's their task, is how can I pass on my wisdom? And so what does that look like for an older generation, an aging generation in your parish? What would help them feel emotionally safe to pass on their wisdom? And for a younger person, what would help them feel emotionally safe to actually form their identity and ask challenging questions about, hey, is this what Christianity really is? Because you and I talked about me being a Sunday school teacher last time around, and how we asked those really blunt, direct questions of, are you happy with the church? Does this church feel like one where you want to stay in? Does this church feel like one where you want to get married into and raise a family into? As a high school student, do you see a future here? They want to answer those questions because that's all identity formation questions, right? And so we can definitely use psychological theory to help direct these KPIs, help direct challenging of stigma, and also increasing mental health literacy and making it more emotionally safe and being able to deal with deeper stuff like grief whenever it does come up.
That's really profound. I think we need a third podcast on that last piece, on the, surveys, and the word permission structure
Mm,
comes to mind. It's kinda like, even for the surveys, we have to emphasize to the community, please be honest, because we can only create things in response to how direct you are in expressing your needs. And so even at that level, it's like that's a test of whether they're willing to break taboos, right? And how the leadership responds is itself at risk, because if people are putting themselves out there and it's not reciprocated or
mm.
recognized, it can compound the feelings of
Yes,
disenfranchisement.
absolutely. And that's where it takes, we use that term, it takes a village, and it has to be a cultural shift. We all have to be on the same page of why we're doing and what we're aiming to achieve in all of this. So you can't just do a survey for the sake of surveying people and placate the masses, and help them, give them a place to have like this proverbial complaint box so they feel better about, having put their complaint somewhere. That's what a survey can get reduced down to if you don't actually take the results seriously and do something about it. It can feel like you just, the complaint box over there, put it in there, put it on the survey. So, yes, leadership absolutely has to respond to this. And if they don't, it can be more harmful than good. But if you don't give them the opportunity, then it's like, well, then you don't have a pulse on your people either, right? And I think it's far more accessible than not. It could be as simple as do a sermon series on mental health concerns and do a sermon series on shame and stigma, do a sermon series based on some of the stuff we talked about in this podcast, right? That's great. Bring it out into the open, because when a leader stands at a microphone and says, "We're going to talk about this," leaders, whether they are ordained clergy or if they're pastors or if it's just a ministry leader, whoever, when you stand in front of a group and say, "We are going to talk about this and we're going to do it slowly but surely, but at length," it's not a one time deal. You set an example, and there is that top down trickling of, okay, I wanna keep talking about this. Oh, it feels good to actually finally get that off my chest. Feels good to finally be seen in that. Even if I haven't muttered a word, for the leader to be saying that, acknowledging that, is enough to help me to feel seen and to feel a little bit more open about, you know what, maybe I should tell so and so about this thing that's been bothering me this whole time. And that's how we build a community where it's not just leaders supporting people, but people supporting each other. And that, I think, is what every leader wants in a parish is, wouldn't it be nice if we all did a better job of being good Christians to one another? So that leadership didn't have to keep coming up with all these ministry plans and all of these ministry initiatives and all these ways to scoop people up and respond to their various confessions and struggles. It's a strain on leadership too, to make them solely responsible for the well-being of the church. It has to be on every single one of us, right? Community is an amazingly healing factor. And in the psych research, you'll see risk factors versus protective factors. So risk factors meaning it increases your risk of developing something like PTSD or depression or trauma or whatever. Protective factors are the ones that decrease the likelihood that you will have those adverse effects. Community can go either way, especially in immigrant communities. It can be something that perpetuates stigma and turns into a risk factor, or it can be something that challenges that stigma, challenges the shame, and in especially in Christian communities can be a deeply protective factor. But it's up to each individual person, not just the leaders, every individual person, every individual Christian to say, I'm going to be the good Samaritan. I'm going to be the person who is a protective factor for one person. Even if it's just that one random person who came in off the street during coffee hour, I'm going to be make sure I am a presence of that good Samaritan. I'm a presence of Christ. I'm a presence of grace. I'm a presence of being emotionally safe, however I can be. And if I don't know what that means, I'm going to sit down and reflect and I'm going to learn and I'm going to gain the skills that I need to be able to do that.
You've given me new language for why I organize the mental health conference, for which you will be a plenary speaker, and for why mental health is one of the four focal areas of the Center for Asian American Christianity. And the new language you gave me is church can be a risk factor, but it can also be a protective factor. And I think you've given us a concluding note, a concluding point that is hopeful and even inspirational, that church leaders, ministry leaders can exercise leadership that nudges the church into the protective factor space through these mental health commitments. So I think that's a great vision. And I love how you've begun to outline some practical leadership steps for our faith leaders to take.
Love it. I love it. I hope everybody listening does not feel overwhelmed and instead feels inspired, as you said, that, yeah, I think the work is set before us, right? And this is the work that has been there since the time that the scripture was written, since the time of Paul sending letters to different communities and saying, hey, be good to each other, love each other, and First John is a great example of that, of just loving people. So I hope that any leader listening maybe will feel inspired to reread the epistle of First John and be like, okay, can I pull some KPIs out of this for my church? Because this is what we're supposed to be. We're supposed to be the love of Christ for everybody. Maybe start there. And I think that's a good way to develop some KPIs for your own self as an individual, not just as a parish, but am I exemplifying this for everybody I meet too? And that's lifelong work, like you said. It's not something you're just gonna achieve overnight, that this is lifelong work to be continually sharpened and become the presence of Christ for people throughout the world.
It's lifelong work, and you've given us some humble beginning steps. Sangeetha, thank you so much for sharing your clinical experience and your wisdom as a Christian faith leader. And I look forward to continuing the conversation with you.
Thank you so much. This has been great.